The Secret Doctrine by Elena Petrovna Blavatsky, a facsimile of the original edition of 1888, printed by the Cunningham Press, Alhambra, California. Book 2, Part 1, Anthropogenesis, stanzas translated with commentaries, from the Secret Book of... Additional fragments from a commentary on the verses of stanza 12. The manuscripts from which these additional explanations are taken belongs to the group called Tongshatsky Sangye Songa, or the records of the 35 Buddhas of confession, as they are exoterically called. These personages, however, though called in the northern Buddhist religion Buddhas, may just as well be called rishis or avatars, etc., as they are Buddhas who have preceded Sakyamuni, only for the northern followers of the ethics preached by Gautama. These great Mahatmas or Buddhas are a universal and common property. They are historical sages, at any rate for all the occultists who believe in such a hierarchy of sages, the existence of which has been proved to them by the learned ones of the fraternity. They are chosen from among some 97 Buddhas in one group and 53 in another, mostly imaginary personages, who are really the personifications of the powers of the first-named. Notes. Gautama Buddha, named Shakyatupa, is the 27th of the last group, as most of these Buddhas belong to the divine dynasties which instructed mankind. And note, of these Buddhas, or the enlightened, the far distant predecessors of Gautama the Buddha, and who represent, we are taught, once living men, great adepts and saints, in whom the sons of wisdom has incarnated, and who were, therefore, so to speak, minor avatars of the celestial beings. 11 only belong to the Atlantean race, and 24 to the fifth race from its beginnings. They are identical with the Tirthankaras of the Jainas. End of notes. These, quote, baskets, unquote, of the oldest writings, unquote, palm leaves, unquote, are kept very secret. Each manuscript has appended to it a short synopsis of the history of that sub-race to which the particular Buddha-la belonged. The one special manuscript from which the fragments which follow are extracted and then rendered into a more comprehensible language is said to have been copied from stone tablets which belonged to a Buddha of the earliest day of the fifth race, who had witnessed the deluge and the submersion of the chief continents of the Atlantean race. The day when much, if not all, of that which is given here from the archaic records will be found correct is not far distant. Then the modern symbologists will acquire the certitude that even Odin, or the god Woden, the highest god in the German and Scandinavian mythology, is one of the 35 Buddhas, one of the earliest indeed, for the continent to which he and his race belonged is also one of the earliest. So early, in truth, that in the days when tropical nature was to be found, when now lie eternal, unthawing snows, one could cross almost by dry land from Norway, via Iceland and Greenland, to the lands that at present surround Hudson's Bay. Note. This may account for the similarity of the artificial mounds in the U.S. of America and the tumuli in Norway. It is this identity that led some American archaeologists to suggest that Norwegian mariners had discovered America some 1,000 years ago. Vidar Holmberg's Traces de Bouddhisme en Norvège, page 23. There is no doubt that America is that far distant land into which pious men and heavy storms had transferred the sacred doctrine, as the Chinese writer suggested by his description to Newman. But neither Professor Holmberg of Stockholm nor the American archaeologists have guessed the right age of the mounds or the tumuli. The fact that Norwegians may have rediscovered the land that their long-forgotten forefathers believed to have perished in the general submersion does not conflict with that other fact that the secret doctrine of the land, which was the cradle of physical man and of the fifth race, had found its way into the so-called New World ages and ages before the sacred doctrine of Buddhism. End of note. Just as in the palmy days of the Atlantean giants, the sons of the giants from the east, a pilgrim could perform a journey from what nowadays is termed the Sahara Desert to the lands which now rest in dreamless sleep at the bottom of the waters of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea. Events which were never written outside the human memory, but which were religiously transmitted from one generation to another and from race to race, may have been preserved by a constant transmission within the book volume of the brain, and through countless aeons, with more truth and accuracy than inside any written document or record. That which is part of our souls is eternal, says Thackeray, and what can be nearer to our souls than that which happens at the dawns of our lives? Those lives are countless, but the soul or spirit that animates us throughout these myriads of existences is the same. And though the book and volume of the physical brain may forget events within the scope of one terrestrial life, the bulk of collective recollections can never desert the divine soul within us. Its whispers may be too soft, the sound of its words too far off the plane perceived by our physical senses, yet the shadow of events that were, just as much as the shadow of the events that are to come, is within its perceptive powers and is ever present before its mind's eye. It is this soul voice, perhaps, which tells those who believe in tradition more than in written history that what is said below is all true and relates to prehistoric facts. This is what is written in one passage. The kings of light have departed in wrath. The sins of men have become so black that earth quivers in her great agony. The azure seats remain empty. Who of the brown, who of the red, or yet among the black races can sit in the seat of the blessed, the seats of the knowledge and mercy? Who can assume the flower of power, the plant of the golden stem, and the azure blossom? Unquote. The Kings of Light is the name given in all old records to the sovereigns of the divine dynasties. The azure seats are translated celestial thrones in certain documents. The flower of power is now the lotus, or it may have been at that period, who can tell? The writer proceeds, like the later Jeremiah, to bewail the fate of his people. They had become bereft of their azure celestial kings, and they of the diva hue, the moon-like complexion, and they of the refulgent golden face, have gone to the land of bliss, the land of metal and fire, or, agreeably with the rules of symbolism, to the lands lying north and east, from whence the great waters have been swept away, sucked in by the earth and dissipated in the air. The wise races had perceived the black storm dragons, called down by the dragons of wisdom, and had fled, led on by the shining protectors of the most excellent land, the great ancient adepts, presumably those the Hindus refer to as their Manus and Rishis. One of them was Vaivashvata Manu. They of the yellow hue are the forefathers of those whom ethnology now classes as the Turanians, the Mongols, Chinese, and other ancient nations, and the land they fled to was no other than Central Asia. There entire new races were born. There they lived and died until the separation of the nations. But this separation did not take place either in the localities assigned for it by modern science, nor in the way the Aryans are shown to have divided and separated by Mr. Max Müller and other Aryanists. Nearly 2/3 of 1 million years have elapsed since that period. The yellow-faced giants of the post-Atlantean day had ample time, throughout this forced confinement to one part of the world, and with the same racial blood, and without any fresh infusion or admixture in it, to branch off during a period of nearly 700,000 years into the most heterogeneous and diversified types. Nowhere does a more extraordinary variability of types exist, from black to almost white, from gigantic men to dwarfish races, and this only because of their forced isolation. The Africans have never left their continent for several hundred thousands of years. If tomorrow the continent of Europe were to disappear and other lands to re-emerge instead, and if the African tribes were to separate and scatter on the face of the earth, it is they who, in about 100,000 years hence, would form the bulk of the civilized nations. And it is the descendants of those of our highly cultured nations who might have survived on some one island without any means of crossing the new seas that would fall back into a state of relative savagery. Thus the reason given for dividing humanity into superior and inferior races falls to the ground and becomes a fallacy. Such are the statements made and facts given in the archaic records. Collating and comparing with them with some modern theories of evolution minus natural selection, vide physiological selection, by G.J. Romanes, FRS. These statements appear quite reasonable and logical. Note, read the first pages of Part 3, Science and the Secret Doctrine contrasted. End of note. Thus, while the Aryans are the descendants of the Yellow Adams, the gigantic and highly civilized Atlanto-Aryan race, the Semites and the Jews along with them are those of the Red Adam, and thus both the Quatrefages and the writers of the Mosaic Genesis are right. For, could chapter 5 of the first book of Moses be compared with the genealogies found in our archaic Bible, the period from Adam unto Noah would be found noticed therein, of course under different names, the respective years of the patriarchs being turned into periods, the whole being shown symbolical and allegorical. In the manuscripts under consideration, many and frequent are the references to the great knowledge and civilization of the Atlantean nations, showing the polity of several of them and the nature of the arts and sciences. If the third root race, the Lemur Atlanteans, are already spoken of as having been drowned with their high civilization and gods, as in Esoteric Buddhism, page 65, how much more may the same be said of the Atlanteans? It is from the fourth race that the early Aryans got their knowledge of the bundle of wonderful things, the Sabha and Mayasabha, mentioned in the Mahabharata, the gift of Mayasur to the Pandavas. It is from them that they learned aeronautics, Vivan Vidya, the knowledge of flying in air vehicles, and therefore their great arts of meteorography and meteorology. It is from them, again, that the Aryans inherited their most valuable science of the hidden virtues of precious and other stones, of chemistry, or rather alchemy, of mineralogy, geology, physics, and astronomy. Several times the writer has put to herself the question, is the story of Exodus, in its details at least, as narrated in the Old Testament, original? Or is it, like the story of Moses himself and many others, simply another version of the legends told of the Atlanteans? For who, upon hearing the story told of the latter, will fail to perceive the great similarity of the fundamental features? The anger of, quote, God, unquote, at the obduracy of Pharaoh, his command to the chosen ones to spoil the Egyptians before departing of their jewels of silver and jewels of gold, from Exodus 11, and finally the Egyptians and their Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea, in chapter 14. For here is a fragment of the earlier story from the commentary. And the great king of the dazzling face, the chief of all the yellow-faced, was sad, seeing the sins of the black-faced. He sent his air vehicles, Vivan, to all his brother chiefs, chiefs of other nations and tribes, with pious men within, saying, Prepare, arise ye men of the good law, and cross the land while yet dry. The lords of the storm are approaching, their chariots are nearing the land. 1 night and 2 days only shall the lords of the dark face, the sorcerers, live on this patient land. She is doomed, and they have to descend with her. The nether lords of the fires, the gnomes and fire elementals, are preparing their magic, Agniyastra, fire weapons worked by magic. But the lords of the dark eye, evil eye, are stronger than they, the elementals, and they are the slaves of the mighty ones. They are versed in Ashtar, Vidya, the highest magical knowledge. Note, wrote the late Brahmakari Bhava, a yogi of great renown and holiness. Extensive works on Ashtar Vidya and such other sciences were at different times compiled in the language of the times, but the Sanskrit originals were lost at the time of the partial deluge of our country. See Theosophist of June, 1880. Some things the Aryans knew. For Agniyastra, see Wilson's Specimens of the Hindu Theatre, Volume 1, page 297. End of note. Come and use yours, that is, your magic powers, in order to counteract those of the sorcerers. Let every lord of the dazzling face, an adept of the white magic, cause the vivan of every lord of the dark face to come into his hands, or possession, lest any of the sorcerers should by its means escape from the waters, avoid the rod of the four karmic deities, and save his wicked followers or people. May every yellow face send sleep from himself, within brackets mesmerize, ? To every black face. May even they, the sorcerers, avoid pain and suffering. May every man true to the solar gods bind and paralyze every man under the lunar gods, lest he should suffer or escape his destiny. And may every yellow face offer of his life water, blood, to the speaking animal of a black face, lest he awaken his master. The hour has struck, the black night is ready, etc., etc. Note, some wonderful artificially made beast, similar in some way to Frankenstein's creation, which spoke and warned his master of every approaching danger. The master was a, quote, black magician, unquote. The mechanical animal was informed by a jinn, an elemental, according to their accounts. The blood of a pure man alone could destroy him. Read Part 2, Section 26, 7 in Astronomy, Science, and Magic. End of note. Let their destiny be accomplished. We are the servants of the Great Four. May the kings of light return. Note, the four karmic gods, called the four Mahajaras in the stanzas. End of note. The great king fell upon his dazzling face and wept. When the king assembled, the waters had already moved, but the nations had now crossed the dry lands. They were beyond the watermark. Their kings reached them in their vivans and led them on to the lands of fire and metal, east and north. Still, in another passage, it is said, stars, or meteors, showered on the lands of the black faces, but they slept. The speaking beasts, the magic watchers, kept quiet. The Netherlords waited for orders, but they came not, for their masters slept. The waters arose and covered the valleys from one end of the earth to the other. High lands remained. The bottom of the earth, the lands of the antipodes, remained dry. There dwelt those who escaped. The men of the yellow faces and of the straight eye, that is, the frank and sincere people. When the lords of the dark faces awoke and bethought themselves of their vivans in order to escape from the rising waters, they found them gone. Then a passage shows some of the more powerful magicians of the dark face, who awoke earlier than the others, pursuing those who had spoilt them, and who were in their rearguard. For the nations that were led away were as thick as the stars of the Milky Way, says a more modern commentary, written in Sanskrit only. Like a dragon snake uncoils slowly its body, so the sons of men, led on by the sons of wisdom, opened their folds, and spreading out, expanded like a running stream of sweet waters. Many of the faint-hearted among them perished on their way, but most were saved. Yet the pursuers, whose heads and chests soared high above the water, chased them for 3 lunar terms, until finally reached by the rising waves. They perished to the last man, the soil sinking under their feet and the earth engulfing those who had desecrated her. This sounds a good deal like the original material upon which the similar story in Exodus was built many hundred thousands of years later. The biography of Moses, the story of his birth, childhood, and rescue from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter, is now shown to have been adapted from the Chaldean narrative about Sargon. And if so, the Assyrian title in the British Museum being a good proof of it, why not that of the Jews robbing the Egyptians of their jewels, the death of Pharaoh and his army, and so on? The gigantic magicians of Ruta and Daitya, the lords of the dark face, may have become in the later narrative the Egyptian Magi, and the yellow-faced nations of the 5th race, the virtuous sons of Jacob, the chosen people. One more statement has to be made. There have been several divine dynasties, a series for every root race beginning with the 3rd, each series according and adapted to its humanity. The last 7 dynasties referred to in the Egyptian and Chaldean records belong to the 5th race, which, though generally called Aryan, was not entirely so, as it was ever largely mixed up with races to which ethnology gives other names. It would be impossible in view of the limited space at our disposal to go any further into the description of the Atlanteans, in whom the whole East believes as much as we believe in the ancient Egyptians, but whose existence the majority of the Western scientists deny, as they have denied before this many truths from the existence of Homer down to that of the carrier pigeon. The civilization of the Atlanteans was greater even than that of the Egyptians. It is their degenerate descendants, the nation of Plato's Atlantis, which built the first pyramids in the country, and that certainly before the advent of the Eastern Ethiopians, as Herodotus calls the Egyptians. This may be well inferred from the statement made by Ammianus Marcellinus, who says of the pyramids that there are also subterranean passages and winding retreats, which, it is said, men skillful in the ancient mysteries, by means of which they divided the coming of a flood, constructed in the different places, lest the memory of all the sacred ceremonies should be lost. These men who divined the coming of floods were not Egyptians, who never had any except the periodical rising of the Nile. Who were they? The last remnants of the Atlanteans, we maintain. Those races which are dimly suspected by science, and thinking of which Mr. Gould, the well-known geologist, says, "Can we suppose that we have at all exhausted the great museum of nature? Have we in fact penetrated yet beyond its antechambers? Does the written history of man, comprising of a few thousand years, embrace the whole course of his intelligent existence? Or have we, in the long mythical eras, extending over hundreds of thousands of years, and recorded in the chronologies of Chaldea and of China, shadowy mementos of prehistoric man, handed down by tradition, and perhaps transported by a few survivors to existing lands from others, which, like the fabled, Atlantis of Plato, may have been submerged, or the scene of some great catastrophe which destroyed them with all their civilization." See Mythical Monsters, page 19. After this one can turn with more confidence to the words of a master who wrote several years before these words were penned by Mr. Gould. Quote, "The 4th race had its periods of the highest civilization. Greek and Roman and even Egyptian civilizations are nothing compared to the civilizations that began with the 3rd race, after its separation. But if this civilization and the mastery of arts and sciences are denied to the 3rd and 4th races, no one will deny that between the great civilizations of antiquity, such as those of Egypt and India, there stretched the dark ages of crass ignorance and barbarism ever since the beginning of the Christian era up to our modern civilization, during which period all recollection of these traditions was lost." As said in Isis Unveiled, why should we forget that ages before the adventurous Genoese clove the western waters, the Phoenician vessels had circumnavigated the globe and spread civilization in regions now silent and deserted? What archaeologist will dare assert that the same hand which planned the pyramids of Egypt, Karnak, and the 1,000 ruins now crumbling to oblivion on the sandy banks of the Nile did not erect the monumental Nakhon Wat of Cambodia, or trace the hieroglyphics on the obelisks and doors of the deserted Indian village newly discovered in British Columbia by Lord Dufferin, or those on the ruins of Palenque and Uxmal of Central America? Do not the relics we treasure in our museums, last mementos of the long-lost arts, speak loudly in favor of ancient civilization? And do they not prove over and over again that nations and continents that have passed away have buried along with them arts and sciences which neither the first crucible ever heated in a medieval cloister, nor the last, cracked by a modern chemist, have revived, nor will, at least in the present century? The same question may be put now that was put then. It may be once more asked, how does it happen that the most advanced standpoint that has been reached in our times only enables us to see in the dim distance up the alpine path of knowledge the monumental proofs that early explorers have left to mark the plateau they had reached and occupied? If modern masters are so much in advance of the old ones, why do they not restore to us the lost arts of our post-diluvian forefathers? Why do they not give us the unfolding colors of Luxor, the Tyrian purple, the bright vermilion and dazzling blue which decorate the walls of this place, and are as bright as on the first day of their application, the indestructible cement of the pyramids and of ancient aqueducts, the Damascus blade which can be turned like a corkscrew in its scabbard without breaking, the gorgeous unparalleled tints of the stained glass that is found amid the dust of old ruins and beams in the windows of ancient cathedrals, and the secret of the true malleable glass. And if chemistry is so little able to rival even the early medieval ages in some arts, why boast of achievements which, according to strong probability, were perfectly known thousands of years ago? The more archaeology and philology advance, the more humiliating to our pride are the discoveries which are daily made. The more glorious testimony do they bear in behalf of those who, perhaps on account of the distance of their remote antiquity, have been until now considered ignorant flounderers in the deepest mire of superstition. Among other arts and sciences, the ancients, as a heirloom from the Atlanteans, had those of astronomy and symbolism, which included the knowledge of the zodiac. As already explained, the whole of antiquity believed, with good reason, that humanity and its races are all intimately connected with the planets, and these with zodiacal signs. The whole world's history is recorded in the latter. In the ancient temples of Egypt this was proved by the Dendera zodiac, but except in an Arabic work, the property of a Sufi, the writer has never met with a correct copy of these marvelous records of the past, as also of the future history of our globe. Yet the original records exist most undeniably. As Europeans are unacquainted with the real zodiacs of India, nor do they understand those they happen to know, witness Bentley, the reader is advised, in order to verify the statement, to turn to the work of Denon, Travels in Egypt, Volume 2, in which, if understood, the two famous Egyptian zodiacs can be found and examined. Having seen them personally, the writer has no longer need to trust to what other students who have examined and studied both very carefully have to say of them. As asserted by the Egyptian priests of Herodotus, who was informed that the terrestrial pole and the pole of the ecliptic had formerly coincided, thus was it found and corroborated by Mackey. Note: the mythological astronomy of the ancients demonstrated by a strangely intuitional symbologist and astronomer, a kind of a self-made adept of Norwich, who lived in the first quarter of this century. End of note. For he states that the poles are represented on the zodiacs in both positions, and in that which shows the poles, polar axis at right angles, there are marks which prove that it was not the last time they were in that position, but the first, after the zodiacs had been traced. Capricorn, he adds, is represented at the North Pole, and Cancer is divided near its middle at the South Pole, which is a confirmation that originally they had their winter when the Sun was in Cancer. But the chief characteristics of its being a monument commemorating the first time that the pole had been in that position are the Lion and the Virgin. See Part 2, section A Mystery of the Zodiac. Broadly calculated, it is believed by the Egyptologists that the Great Pyramid was built 3,350 before Christ. See Proctor, Knowledge, Volume 1, pages 242 and 400, and that Menes and his dynasty existed 750 years before the fourth dynasty, supposed to have built the pyramids, had appeared. See the Great Pyramid, Stanleyland Wake. Thus, 4,100 years before Christ is the age assigned to Menes. Now Sir J. Gardner Wilkinson's declaration that all the facts led to the conclusion that the Egyptians had already made very great progress in the arts of civilization before the age of Menes, and perhaps before they immigrated into the valley of the Nile. Rawlinson's Herodotus, Volume 2, page 345, is very suggestive as destroying this hypothesis. It points to great civilization in prehistoric times, and a still greater antiquity. The Shesu Hor, the servants of Horus, were the people who had settled in Egypt, and, as M. G. Maspero affirms, it is to this prehistoric race that belongs the honor of having founded the principal cities of Egypt and established the most important sanctuaries. This was before the Great Pyramid epoch, and when Egypt had hardly arisen from the waters. Yet they possessed the hieroglyphic form of writing special to the Egyptians, and must have been already considerably advanced in civilization. It was, says Lenormand, the country of the great prehistoric sanctuaries, seats of the sacerdotal dominion, which played the most important part in the origin of civilization. What is the date assigned to this people? We hear of 4,000, at the utmost of 5,000 years before Christ, from Maspero. Now it is claimed that it is by means of the cycle of 25,868 years, the sidereal year, that the approximate year of the erection of the Great Pyramid can be ascertained. Assuming that the long, narrow downward passage was directed towards the pole star of the pyramid builders, astronomers have shown that Alpha Draconis, the then pole star, was in the required position about 3,350 before Christ, as well as in 2,170 before Christ. From Proctor, quoted by Stanleyland Wake. But we are also told that this relative position of Alpha Draconis and Alcyone being the extraordinary one, it could not occur again for a whole sidereal year, from the same source. This demonstrates that, since the Dendera zodiac shows the passage of the 3 sidereal years, the Great Pyramid must have been built 78,000 years ago, or in any case that this possibility deserves to be accepted at least as readily as the later date of 3,350 before Christ. Now on the zodiac of a certain temple in far northern India, as on the Dendra zodiac, the same characteristics of the signs are found. Those who know well the Hindu symbols and constellations will be able to find out by the description of the Egyptians whether the indications of the chronological time are correct or not. On the Dendera zodiac, as preserved by the modern Egyptian, Coptic and Greek adepts, and explained a little differently by Mackie, the lion stands upon the hydra, and his tail is almost straight, pointing downwards at an angle of 40 or 50 degrees, this position agreeing with the original confirmation of these constellations. But in many places we see the lion, Sima, Mackie adds, with his tail turned up over his back and ending with the serpent's head, thereby showing that the lion had been inverted, which indeed must have been the case with the whole zodiac and every other constellation when the pole had been inverted. Speaking of the circular zodiac given also by Denon, he says, "There the lion is standing on the serpent, and his tail forming a curve downward, from which it is found that though 600,000 or 700,000 years must have passed between the two positions, yet they had made but little difference between in the constellations of Leo and the Hydra, while Virgo is represented very differently in the two." In the circular zodiac, the Virgin is nursing her child. But it seems that they had not had that idea when the pole was first within the plane of the ecliptic. For in this zodiac, also given by Denon, we see 3 virgins between the lion and the scales, the last of which holds in her hand an ear of wheat. It is much to be lamented that there is in this zodiac a breach of the figure in the latter part of Leo and the beginning of Virgo, which has taken away 1 decan of each sign. Nevertheless, the meaning is plain, as the 3 zodiacs belong to 3 different epochs, namely to the last 3 family races of the 4th subrace of the 5th root race, each of which must have lived approximately from 25 to 30,000 years. The first of these, the Aryan Asiatics, witnessed the doom of the last of the populations of the giant Atlanteans, who perished some 850,000 years ago, the Ruta and Daitya island continents, toward the close of the Miocene age. Notes: the term Atlantean must not mislead the reader to regard these as one race only, or even a nation. It is as though one said Asiatics. Many, multityped and various were the Atlanteans, who represented several humanities, and almost a countless number of races and nations, more varied indeed than would be the Europeans, were this name to be given indiscriminately to the 5 existing parts of the world, which, at the rate colonization is proceeding, will be the case perhaps in less than 200 or 300 years. There were brown, red, yellow, white and black Atlanteans, giants and dwarfs, as some African tribes comparatively are even now. A note: says a teacher in Esoteric Buddhism on page 64. In the Eocene age, even in its very first part, the great cycle of the 4th race men, the Lemur Atlanteans, had already reached its highest point of civilization. And the great continent, the father of nearly all the present continents, showed the first symptoms of sinking. And on page 70 it is shown that Atlantis as a whole perished during the Miocene period. To show how the continents, races, nations, and cycles overleap each other, one has but to think of Lemuria, the last of whose lands perished about 700,000 years before the beginning of the Tertiary period. See page 65 of the same work. And the last of Atlantis, only 11,000 years ago, thus both overlapping, one the Atlantean period and the other the Aryan. End of note. The 4th subrace witnessed the destruction of the last remnant of the Atlanteans, the Aryan Atlanteans, in the last island of Atlantis, namely some 11,000 years ago. In order to understand this, the reader is asked to glance at the diagram of the genealogical tree of the 5th root race, generally, though hardly correctly, called the Aryan race, and the explanations appended to it. Let the reader remember well that which is said of the divisions of root races and the evolution of humanity in this work, and stated clearly and concisely in Mr. Sinnett's Esoteric Buddhism. 1. There are 7 rounds in every Manvantara. This one is the 4th, and we are in the 5th root race at present. 2. Each root race has 7 subraces. 3. Each subrace has in its turn 7 ramifications, which may be called branch or family races. 4. The little tribes, shoots and offshoots of the last named are countless and depend on karmic action. Examine the genealogical tree hereto appended and you will understand. The illustration is purely diagrammatic and is only intended to assist the reader in obtaining a slight grasp of the subject amidst the confusion which exists between the terms which have been used at different times for the divisions of humanity. It is also here attempted to express in figures, but only within approximate limits for the sake of comparison, the duration of time through which it is possible to definitely distinguish one division from another. It would only lead to hopeless confusion if an attempt were made to give accurate dates to a few, for the races, sub-races, etc., down to their smallest ramifications, overlap and are entangled with each other until it is nearly impossible to separate them. The human race has been compared to a tree, and this serves admirably as an illustration. The main stem of a tree may be compared to the root race. A. Its larger limbs on the various subraces, 7 in number, B1, B2. On each of these limbs are 7 branches or family races, C. After this, the cactus plant is a better illustration, for its fleshy leaves are covered with sharp spines, each of which may be compared to a nation or tribe of human beings. Now our 5th root race has already been in existence as a race sui generis, and quite free from its parent stem about 1 million years. Therefore it must be inferred that each of the 4 preceding subraces has lived approximately 210,000 years. Thus each family race has an average existence of about 30,000 years. Thus the European family race has still a good many thousand years to run, although the nations or the innumerable spines upon it vary with each succeeding season of 3,000 or 4,000 years. It is somewhat curious to mark the comparative approximation of duration between the lives of a family race and a sidereal year. The knowledge of the foregoing and the accurately correct division formed part and parcel of the mysteries, where these sciences were taught to the disciples, and where they were transmitted by one hierophant to another. Everyone is aware that the European astronomers assign, arbitrarily enough, the date of the invention of the Egyptian zodiac to the years 2000 or 2400 before Christ, says Proctor, and insist that this invention coincides in its date with that of the erection of the Great Pyramid. This, to an occultist and Eastern astronomer, must appear quite absurd. The year of the Kali Yuga is said to have begun between the 7th and 18th of February in the year 3102 before Christ. Now the Hindus claim that in the year 20,400 before Kali Yuga, the origin of their zodiac coincided with the spring equinox, there being at the time a conjunction of the sun and moon, and be proved by a lengthy and careful computation of that date that even if fictitious, the epoch from which they had started to establish the beginning of their Kali Yuga was very real. That epoch is the year 3102 before our era, he writes. 3 Part 3, Book 1, Hindu Astronomy Defended by an Academician. The lunar eclipse arriving just a fortnight after the beginning of the Black Age, it took place in a point situated between the wheat ear of Virgo and the star Origo of the same constellation. One of the most esoteric cycles is based upon certain conjunctions and respective positions of Virgo and the Pleiades, Kritika. Hence, as the Egyptians brought their zodiac from southern India and Lanka, or Ceylon, the esoteric meaning was evidently identical. The three virgins, or the Virgo in three different positions, meant with both the record of the first three divine or astronomical dynasties who taught the third root race, and after having abandoned the Atlanteans to their doom, returned, or redescended rather, during the third subrace of the fifth, in order to reveal to saved humanity the mysteries of their birthplace, the sidereal heavens. The same symbolical record of the human races and the three dynasties, gods, Manish, semi-divine astrals of the third and fourth, and the quote heroes unquote of the fifth race, which preceded the purely human kings, was found in the distribution of the tiresome passages of the Egyptian labyrinth. As the three inversions of the poles of course changed the phase of the zodiac, a new one had to be constructed each time. In Mackie's Sphinxiad, the speculations of the bold author must have horrified the orthodox portion of the population of Norwich, as he says, fantastically enough. But after all, the greatest length of time recorded by those monuments, the labyrinth, the pyramids, and the zodiacs, does not exceed 5 millions of years, which is not so, which falls short of the records given us both by the esoteric Chinese and Hindus, which latter nation has registered a knowledge of time for 7 or 8 millions of years, which I have seen upon a talisman of porcelain. Notes. The forefathers of the Aryan Brahmins had their zodiacal calculations and zodiac from those born by Kriya Shakti power, the sons of Yoga, the Egyptians from the Atlanteans of Ruta, and the former, the Chinese, therefore, may have registered time for 7 or 8 millions of years, but the Egyptians could not. End of notes. The Egyptian priests had the zodiacs of the Atlantean Ashura Maya, as the modern Hindus still have. As stated in esoteric Buddhism, the Egyptians, as well as the Greeks and Romans, some 1,000 years ago, were remnants of the Atlanto-Aryans, that is, the former of the older or the Ruta Atlanteans, the last named, the descendants of the last race of that island, whose sudden disappearance was narrated by Solon to the Egyptian initiates. The human dynasty of the old Egyptians, beginning with Manish, had all the knowledge of the Atlanteans, though there was no more Atlantean blood in their veins. Nevertheless, they had preserved all their archaic records. All this has been shown long ago. Note, this question was amply challenged, and as amply discussed and answered. See 5 Years of Theosophy, article Mr. Sinnott's Esoteric Buddhism, pages 325 to 46. End of note. And it is just because the Egyptian zodiac is between 75 and 80,000 years old that the zodiac of the Greeks is far later. Volney has correctly pointed out, in his Ruins of Empires, page 360, that it is only 16,984 years old, or up to the present date, 17,082. Note. Volney says that as Aries was in its 15th degree, 1447 before Christ, it follows that the first degree of Libra could not have coincided with the vernal equinox more lately than 15,194 years before Christ, to which, if you add 1,790 since Christ, when Volney wrote this, it appears that 16,984 years have elapsed since the Greek, or rather Hellenic, origin of the zodiac.